Hey friends, what up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Yud, Daf 10 of Masechta Sukkah. Daf Yud begins with a statement of Rabbi Yirmiyah describing all sorts of different sukkahs on top and below other sukkahs, and which ones are allowed, which ones are not allowed, which ones of course are kosher, and which ones are pasul. We discuss that when you have a sukkah underneath another sukkah, what's sort of the minimum space for the top sukkah for it to be considered a sukkah on top of it? Meaning, if you have a sukkah and then there's like a little bit of space on top, and then there's more schach, is that considered another sukkah, or is it just considered like thick schach? Like double-decker schach. So like how much space has to be between the two layers of schach for it to be considered a sukkah under a sukkah, and not just considered like, I don't know, double schach layers, I guess. Okay, putting sheets under your schach to like catch things that fall down, and sukkah decorations a little bit. Those in Yonim Chav. Let's go weiter. So we're going to start. There's a little bit of work to do on Daf Testament Beis, but we kind of had to do it this way because this is really going to be the flow for a little bit. So we got about, I'd say, 10 or more lines left to do on Daf Testament Beis. Amr B'Yirmiyah. So again, it's about 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 lines from the bottom. Amr B'Yirmiyah. Paim Shishtein Ksheris. So sometimes if you have two sukkahs, one on top of the other, sometimes both of them could be kosher. Paim Shishtein Psulas. Sometimes both of them will be pasul. Paim Shetachton Ksher V'Elyona Psula. Sometimes the bottom one's kosher, the top one's pasul. Paim Shetachton Psula V'Elyona Ksher. And sometimes the bottom one is the pasul one, and the top one is the kosher one. Okay, so you can basically have all configurations, both kosher, both pasul, and then one kosher, one pasul. Sometimes the top, sometimes the bottom. So what's the case where you can have a sukkah on top of another sukkah? Because of course, as we learned yesterday, right, it says basukos teishu, and it says right, it's written sukkahs, which is singular. That you have to sit in one sukkah, not a sukkah that's underneath another one. So now, sometimes you can have a situation where you have two sukkahs, one on top of the other, and yet they're both acceptable, they're both kosher. How so? Kigon shetachton chamasa muba mitzilasa ve'elyona tzilasa muba mechamasa. Well, if the bottom sukkah is chamasa muba mitzilasa, so it's got more sun than there is shade, in which case the bottom schach isn't really schach, right? And therefore it doesn't count. Schach is bottle because it's chamas and moving mitzilasa. So whatever schach there is considered bottle. And you have the schach from the top sukkah, right? Because that one's tzilas and moving mechamasa. And the schach of the top sukkah is within 20 amos of the ground. So basically what happens is you have these two sukkahs, one on top of the other one, but the bottom one really isn't a sukkah because it's chamas and moving mitzilasa. So whatever schach there is basically bottle. So it's like it doesn't exist. And as long as the schach from the top sukkah, which is tilas and moving mechamasa, is within 20 amos of the ground, so essentially you just have the schach from the top sukkah that you're using for essentially both sukkahs. That's the kosher schach. It's within 20 amos of the ground, all good. Paim shishtem psulis. Hey Chidami, how do you have a situation where both the top and bottom sukkahs are going to be pasul? Well, for example, if both of them have tzilas and mubim mechamos and more shade than there is sun, in which case you have a sukkah underneath the sukkah, right? Mamish, the bottom sukkah is a sukkah and the top sukkah is a sukkah. And the top sukkah is too tall. Is above 20 amas, and therefore the bottom sukkah is pasul because it's a sukkah under a sukkah, and the top sukkah is pasul because it's more than 20 amas tall. Sometimes the bottom one can be kosher and the top one can be pasul. Hey Chidami, how's this? For example, if the bottom one is tzilasa muba mechamasa, so that's a kosher sukkah, and the top one is chamasa muba mitzilasa, which means there's more sun than shade, which means that the schach is essentially bottle, in which case the top sukkah is no good, but the bottom sukkah is fine. Now, both of the sukkahs of both sukkahs are within 20 amas, because if the sukkah from the top sukkah was above 20 amas, well then it would be sukkah pasul, and then it would be joined together with the sukkah kosher of the bottom sukkah. It would create a headache. But as long as the sukkah of the top sukkah, which is chamos mubim mitzilasa, is within 20 amas of the ground, so then basically the sukkah is bottle to the sun, to the chamos mubim mitzilasa, and it's not there, right? It's gone, and you have the kosher sukkah on the bottom, and givaldig. And sometimes the top one could be kosher and the bottom one is pasul. How's this? Could go into tarvayu tzilasa mubim mechamason. For example, if both of them are tzilasa mubim mechamason, more shade than there is sun. So, right, v'kaima elyonim b'sochesun, and the top one is within 20 amos. So in this case, the bottom sukkah is pasul because it's a sukkah underneath another sukkah. They're both more shade than sun, so they're both, essentially on paper kosher sukkahs, but the bottom one is underneath another one, so therefore it's no good. But the top one is a kosher sukkah, it's within 20 amas, so givaldig. Okay, so chevre, there you have it. You can have a situation where they're both kosher, where they're both pasul, and where one of them is kosher, one of them is pasul, either the top one or the bottom one. Fine. So, pshita. So the Gemara says, well, in a situation where one of them is chamos mubim mitzilasa, so of course that one just kind of won't count. So for example, if you have the bottom one is tzilasa mubim mechamasa, and the top one is chamos mubim mitzilasa, so we said that the bottom one is going to be kosher. So tachton ksher ve'elyon psulet tzrichale, we had to teach the case of where the sukkah on the bottom is tzilasa mubim mechamasa and the sukkah on the top is chamasa mubim mitzilasa, and we said the bottom one is taka kosher, because Ma'adetema may have thought to say nigzer duma mitztayiv schach pasul ba'ad schach kosher kamash malon. Well, I might have the avmina to say that even in a situation where the bottom one is tzilasa mubim mechamasa and the top one is chamasa mubim mitzilasa, and both of them are within 20 amas of the ground. So I might have the avmina to say that even though technically speaking the bottom one should be kosher, however, out of concern for a situation where the top one is above 20 amas from the ground, in which case the schach is schach pasul, and it'll mix together and it'll create a headache for the tzilas mubim mechamasa schach on the bottom because you have schach pasul. So then I might think to say that even when the top schach is within 20 amas, still will say that the bottom sukkah is pasul. Komash malon, that no, as long as the top sukkah, the schach is within 20 amas of the ground, so then if the bottom sukkah is tzilas mubim mechamasa and the top sukkah is chamos mubim mitzilasa, so then we'll say that the bottom sukkah is kosher. Chevy, you got that? Good. Kamiye ben sukkah l'sukkah v'tei tachtona psula. Givaldig. So when we say sukkah tachas sukkah, right? So let's just say they're both tzilasa mubim mechamasa. They both have more shade than they have sun, and we said that the bottom sukkah in that case is pasul and the top sukkah is kosher. So how tall basically does the top sukkah have to be in order to invalidate the lower sukkah? So Mavuna says a tefach. If there's one tefach, so basically if you build a sukkah, let's say, and you put on schach, and then you have a space of a tefach, and then you put on another layer of schach, says Rav Huna, that would already be considered a sukkah tachas sukkah, and the bottom sukkah would be pasul, and the top sukkah, I don't know, it's hard to say it would be kosher because it's only a tefach. I don't know how you would exactly fit in, but I guess you'd probably just not be able to use that sukkah at all because the bottom would be considered a sukkah tachas sukkah. Shekin matzinu bo ohale tuma tefach, because by an ohel, by a tent, in regard to tuma, a tefach is considered an ohel. The Tanan, as we learn in the Mishnah, tefach al tefach, boom tefach. If you have something that is 1 tefach by 1 tefach with the height of tefach, maybe it's a tumah v'chotzitz b'fnei tumah. It brings tumah and it makes a chatzitza from tumah. What does that mean? So what's bringing tumah? We actually learned this in Masechta Shabbos, probably daf like Yud Gimel or something, or Yud Daled. That imagine you have like a board, okay, and this board is at least a tefach long and it's at least a tefach wide. And on one end of the board, you have a kazayas, beneath one end of the board, you have like a kazayas min hames. And beneath the other end of the board, there's pizza. So the shaila is, is it considered an ohel? Right? Meaning the fact that you have under this one board, you have kazayas mibsar hames, which is mitami ba'ohel. And you also have some pizza. So the question is it going to be considered an ohel? Is it considered like the pizza is in the same ohel as the tumah? And would the pizza be tummy? So we say, well, if the board is 1 tefach by 1 tefach, which it is, and it's at a height of a tefach, suspended off the ground, so then yes, it will create an ohel, and the pizza will be tummy. But if it's less than a tefach, so it will not create an ohel, and the pizza will remain tahor. It won't be considered like it's in an ohel with the kazayis min hames. And also chotzitz b'fnei tumah. So for example, if you have a kazayis min hames, and then you have this board on top of it, and then you have pizza on top of the board, so if the board is 1 tefach off of the ground, so then it creates a space and the tumah would not go through the board into the pizza. However, if the board was less than a tefach from the ground, so then it would not be considered a separation, and the tumah from the k'zayis min hames would go straight through the board and be mitame the pizza. Okay. So we see that when it comes to an ohel of tumah, 1 tefach is what we're after. Tefach lo maybe v'lo chotzitz. But if the space is less than a tefach, so then it will not, if you have the kazayis min hames and the pizza both underneath the board, the same board, if it's less than a tefach suspended from the ground, it will not be considered like they're in the same ohel, and the pizza will be fine. And if the pizza is above the kazayis min hames, but on top of the board, right? Meaning if you have the k'zayis min hames and then the board on top of that and the pizza on top of that, again, if there is a tefach of space, so then the tumah will not go through the board into the pizza. If there's less than a tefach hames, it will go through. So if it's less than a tefach, I don't know what I just said, but if it's less than a tefach from the ground, so then the k'zayis will go through the board into the pizza. Why am I saying all of this? Right, because Rav Huna wants to therefore argue that if there's a tefach of space between, from the schach of the bottom sukkah to the next level of schach, that would already be considered a sukkah underneath a sukkah. Rav Chizda, Rabbi Bar Rav Huna Amrei, Arba. Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna say it would have to be 4 tefachim of space. Shlo matzinu makom chashuv pachos me'arba, because we never find a significant space less than 4 tefachim. Therefore, they want to say that there has to be 4 tefachim of space, between the bottom sukkah and the next level of schach. Ushmuel Omar Asar, and Shmuel says there would have to be 10 tefachim, meaning you'd have to have a sukkah, and then 10 tefachim above that sukkah is basically another sukkah. My time with the Shmuel, how come? Kechsher kach psula. Well, just like it becomes kosher is how it becomes pasul. Me'echsher basar, psula basar. Just like it becomes kosher by 10 tefachim, also becomes pasul by 10 tefachim. So meaning, according to Shmuel, kilu, in order for it to be a sukkah on top, underneath another sukkah, they would mamish both have to be sukkahs. Right? Meaning you'd have to have one sukkah, and on top of that is a sukkah that's 10 tefachim tall. Shmuel argues against Rav Huna and Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, which even though Shmuel was older than all of them, but anyways, Shmuel's arguing and saying, look, people, in order for it to be considered a sukkah underneath a sukkah, they're both going to have to be sukkahs. A tefach isn't a sukkah. 4 tefachim isn't a sukkah. It would have to be 1 sukkah underneath another sukkah. And therefore, in order for the bottom sukkah to be invalidated by being under another sukkah, that top sukkah is going to have to be at least 10 tefachim tall to be, right? It has to be a kosher sukkah. And if you have a kosher sukkah on top of another sukkah, so then at that point, the bottom sukkah becomes possible. But if it's less than 10 tefachim of height between the bottom sukkah and the top sukkah, so then, if it's less than 10 tefachim, so then it won't be an issue of a sukkah underneath another sukkah. Frekti Gemara against Shmuel. Tanan, we learn in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda Omer says, Rabbi Yehuda, im ein diurin be'alyona atachton ksher. If, however, there are no diurin, the simple explanation of that means if there's nobody living in the top sukkah, so then the bottom sukkah is kosher, right? So the Tanna Kama had said that if you have a sukkah underneath another sukkah, so then the bottom sukkah is possible. Rabbi Yehuda argues and says, well, if there's no diurin in the top sukkah, then the bottom sukkah is kosher. Now, Mayan diurin. What does it mean that there's no diurin? Right? The simple explanation would mean that there's nobody living in the top sukkah. But can it really mean that? Ilema diurin mamish, if it literally means, as long as nobody's living in the top sukkah, so then the bottom one is kosher according to Rabbi Yehuda. Altu diurin kogarme. What does this have to do with people living in the top sukkah? We're talking about an architectural problem over here. You're not allowed to have one sukkah underneath another sukkah. That has nothing to do with who's living in it. It has to do with how it's constructed. If you construct a sukkah underneath another sukkah, so that's going to be a problem. It has nothing to do with who's living there. And therefore, so rather what it must mean is that no, architecturally speaking, right, if their top sukkah is not roi, is not able to be lived in, it's not a proper sukkah, so then the bottom sukkah is going to be kosher according to Rabbi Yehuda. What does that mean? It means that it's not 10 tefachim. So meaning, therefore, we want to argue that when Rabbi Yehuda says that if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, it's not a kosher sukkah. So in that case, the bottom sukkah is kosher. Michlal, implying, however, the Tanna Kama savar afal pisha enev ru'uy l'dira psula, implying that according to the Tanna Kama, however, even though the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, it's not able to be used as a sukkah, the bottom one is still possible. So it's a kasha on Shmuel from the rabbis, right? Meaning, Shmuel says that when we say that a sukkah underneath another sukkah is possible, the sukkah on top would have to be at least 10 tefachim. However, we ask a kasha on Shmuel. Because in our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda seems to be saying that if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, so then the bottom sukkah is kosher, like Shmuel is saying. However, the implication being that the rabbis argue. You don't want to argue with the rabbis. And the rabbis seem to be arguing and saying that even if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, the bottom sukkah is still possible. Which is therefore a kasha on Shmuel, who says that if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, the bottom sukkah is kosher. But that sounds like it would specifically be Rabbi Yehuda's opinion, not the rabbis. The rabbis would disagree and say even if it's less than 10 tefachim, the bottom sukkah would still be possible. Which would be a kasha on Shmuel. When Rav Dimi came, my Rava, they say in Eretz Yisrael, no, how do you explain Rabbi Yehuda? You explain him like this. So when Rav Dimi came, he explained that in Eretz Yisrael, they explained Rabbi Yehuda like this. That it's talking about a situation not where the sukkah is less than 10 tefachim. No, the sukkah is 10 tefachim tall. If the sukkah was less than 10 tefachim tall, everybody would agree. If the top sukkah was less than 10 tefachim tall, everybody would agree that the bottom sukkah is kosher. And therefore, it's no problem on Shmuel. Shmuel says if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim tall, the bottom sukkah is kosher. Everyone agrees on that. Chacham also agree with that. However, in Eretz Yisrael, they say that what Rabbi Yehuda is talking about is where the bottom sukkah is not sturdy enough. It's not strong enough to support the top sukkah, and therefore the top sukkah is essentially unusable. So the top sukkah is more than 10 tefachim tall. However, practically speaking, you can't move in over there. You can't bring your pillows and your cushions and really use the top sukkah because the bottom sukkah isn't able to support the top sukkah. And Rabbi Yehuda says that in that case, the bottom sukkah would be kosher since the top sukkah is unusable, since you can't bring in your pillows and cushions and stuff because the bottom sukkah isn't sturdy enough to support the top sukkah. So says Rabbi Yehuda, in that case, it's the bottom sukkah is kosher since you can't use the top sukkah. But effect the Gemara, Michlad the Tanakama Savar, Afal Pishen Ru'i Lekabel Psula. But 1 second, that seems to be implying that according to the Tanakama, even in that case, the bottom sukkah would be possible. That basically, when the top sukkah is unusable, it's not a kosher sukkah because you can't actually move into it and use it. So even though the top sukkah is unusable, the bottom sukkah is still possible. So we see that still, even according to this way of understanding Rabbi Yehuda, in a situation, so Rabbi Yehuda is saying that since the top sukkah is unusable, the bottom sukkah is kosher, but the rabbis are arguing and saying that even in a situation when the top sukkah is unusable, the bottom sukkah is still possible. So it's still a kasha on Shmuel, who says Hekechshera kach psula, that in order for the bottom sukkah to be possible, the top sukkah would have to be kosher, would have to be a kosher sukkah. Yet the Chacham seem to still be saying that if the top, so even in a situation where the top sukkah is unusable, still the bottom sukkah is going to be possible. And the same thing would apply to also less than 10 tefachim. Even though the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim and unusable, still the bottom sukkah would be possible, and therefore it's still a kasha on Shmuel. So the Gemara answers, Ika benayu tichol lekabel aydei adchak. To which the Gemara says, no. The rabbis and Rabbi Yehuda really agree in almost every situation. And therefore the rabbis would agree that if mamish, the top sukkah, was unusable because the bottom sukkah was mamish, not sturdy at all, well then the bottom sukkah would be kosher because the top sukkah is unusable. And they would also agree that if the top sukkah was less than 10 tefachim, the bottom sukkah would be kosher because the top sukkah is a pasul sukkah. So the rabbis agree with Rabbi Yehuda in most cases that if the top sukkah is unusable, either because it's a pasul sukkah, it's too short, or because the bottom sukkah is just unable to support the top sukkah and the top sukkah is unusable, the rabbis would agree with Rabbi Yehuda that the bottom sukkah would be kosher. The only place where they disagree is where you can use the top sukkah aydei adchak. If you're very careful, you could bring in some pillows and cushions and use the top sukkah, but you have to be very careful. So in that case, the rabbis say, look, the top sukkah is usable, even if under sort of extreme circumstances, but the top sukkah is nonetheless usable, well then the bottom sukkah is going to be pasul. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, come on, you have to be able to really use the top sukkah, and if you can't really just, bring in your stuff and move into the top sukkah easily, well then the bottom sukkah is going to still be kosher because you can't really use the top sukkah in that case. That's where the Chacham and Rabbi Yehuda argue. But Shmuel would argue that, the rabbis in principle hold that if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, or if it's mamish, just unusable completely because the bottom sukkah really isn't strong enough to hold it, well, in that case, Shmuel would argue that the rabbis would agree that the bottom sukkah would be kosher. Okay, friends, now we get to a new Mishnah Peris. Aleh sodin mipnei achama o tachtem mipnei nesher. If you take a sheet, right, so you build your sukkah, you have schach and everything, but then lemaisa, it's going to be very hot. It's going to be a hot sukkah. So therefore, you take some kind of a sheet and you spread it out on top of the sukkah, on top of the schach, to protect you somehow from the heat. Or if you put it underneath the schach because you don't want, you're using palm branches and who knows what, maybe there's bugs, maybe there's dirt, and you don't want that stuff falling into your pizza. So therefore, you figure, well, I'll just take a sheet and put it underneath the schach, and therefore any bugs or dirt, whatever, will fall into the sheet. It won't fall onto my pizza. So, Oshe Peres Agabe Akinuf Psula. Or, if you have a bed, and the bed has, 4 kind of legs on the bed, and going up from the 4 legs are like pole bars, and then, connecting the bars are other bars, and you spread a sheet on top of that, and basically you create like a fort inside of the sukkah. So we say in that case also psula. And in that case also it's a problem because you're not in the sukkah, you're in a tent in the sukkah, and we don't want that. But if you just have one bar at your feet and one bar at your head, and then one bar connecting them, and then it's more like a tent, meaning it's more like it comes to a point at the top. It doesn't have like a roof. Well, in that case, it's okay because it's not considered an oil. Fine. So it's not like you're like in a tent inside your sukkah. You want to be in the sukkah. You don't want to be in a tent in the sukkah. And therefore, if it's like a flat roof on top of you, inside of the sukkah, so you're like in a tent with a flat roof inside of the sukkah, that's a problem. But if it's a pointy roof, then it's not considered an oil and it's fine. Omer of Chizda says, the Gemara says of Chizda, Lo shanu el mipnei nesher. When we say that you're not allowed to put a sheet underneath the schach, that's only in order to catch the shmutz. That's a problem. But if you put some kind of a tapestry underneath the schach because you feel that it looks very beautiful, so then that's fine. Pshita, this is obvious. After all, the Mishnah says, don't put a sheet under the schach in order to catch the shmutz. But you can, right? The implication being that there's no problem with putting the sheet underneath the schach because you think it looks good. So the Gemara answers, well, I may have thought to say that actually, no, even to make things look good, you still would not be able to put a sheet underneath the schach. I may have thought to say that the reason why the Mishnah mentions don't put a sheet under the schach in order to catch the shmutz is because that's sort of the general reason why you might want to put a sheet under the schach. But I might think to say that even for decoration, you still should not put a sheet underneath the schach. Komash malon. Therefore, Rav Chizda is saying that no, if it's because you think it makes the sukkah beautiful, you would be allowed to put the sheet underneath the schach. Because in general, a sheet is makabel tumah. I assume it's why because it's like a proper garment of sorts. So therefore, it's makabel tumah. Now, for schach, you're unable to use for schach something that's makabel tumah. And therefore, you'd be unable to use a sheet for schach. And if you're using it to catch shmutz, that's already considered like you're using it for schach, and it's a problem. But if you use it for decorations, your decorations are able to be makabel tumah, that's no problem, and therefore it's acceptable. Let's say that the following brisa supports Rav Chizda, if you put proper schach on the sukkah, and then you kind of decorate it with different kinds of tapestries, and then you dangle from the schach nuts and almonds and peaches and pomegranates, I guess grapevines, and wheat, wines, oils, flowers, also the stavik man. So you're not allowed to get benefit from them until after Sukkot is over. They're muksa. And if you make some kind of stipulations, then it's based on the stipulation that you made. So what do you see? So we see that you're allowed to use these different sheets, right? The Mishnah says, right? If you're allowed to use, what does it say? These different types of tapestries, we said that's no problem. As long as you build proper schach and a proper sukkah, if you want to design it and decorate it with tapestries underneath the schach, that would be acceptable. So let's say that supports Rav Chizda. So the Gemara answers, Dilma min atzad. Well, maybe you can argue that the Brisa is talking about tapestries on the side, maybe not necessarily underneath the schach, so it's not necessarily a proof for Rav Chizda. Okay, it's not a proof, it's not a proof. So, okay, I don't know, it sounds like Rav Chizda's opinion would still stand, which is that if you put a tapestry under the schach, it sounds like that would be acceptable. Itmar, it was stated, no ye sukkah in memaitin b'sukkah. Sukkah decorations do not lessen the height of a sukkah. Now that works in both directions. So, meaning, if you have a sukkah that is taller than 20 amas, and you think, well, why don't I just take some decorations and hang them from the schach, and now from the bottom of the decorations to the bottom of the sukkah will be less than 20 amas, that's not going to work. You can't use the decorations to lower the space of the sukkah because decorations aren't schach. They're decorations. That's the point. If they were schach, then you'd be a problem because they're likely makabel tumah. And it also works in the other direction, which is if you have a sukkah that is 10 tefachim tall and the decorations go into the sukkah, so it's okay. It doesn't make it less than 10 tefachim tall. Fine. Amar Rav Ashi, says Rav Ashi, u'minatzan memaitin. But from the sides, it does make it smaller, right? Meaning, so if you have a sukkah that is Rosh of Rubav Shulchanu exactly, it's 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim, and now you add decorations to the sides, and it kind of eats away at the 7 tefachim by 7 tefachim, it can no longer hold Rosh of Rubav Shulchanu, well then that's going to be a problem. Minyamin Avdid Rav Ashi, Minyamin, the servant of Rav Ashi, Itmisha le kutanta b'maya, he soaked a garment in water, ve'ishtatcha amatzlalta, and then he spread it out on top of the sukkah. So basically, this garment, of course, you cannot use for schach, because it's a garment, it's makabel tumah. And Minyamin spread out this garment to dry on top of the sukkah. Amalei Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi says, then dalye, take off this garment from the sukkah. Don't put it on top of the sukkah. So nobody should think that we're using for schach something that's makabel tumah. So Minyamin responded and he said, yeah, but isn't it obvious that it's wet and the only reason that we're leaving it there is to dry? I mean, once it dries. Meaning, once it dries, make sure that you remove it from on top of the sukkah, because we don't want anybody to think that we're using a garment which is makabel tumah as schach. Okay? Itmar was stated, no ye sukkah amuflagin mimena arba'a. If you have decorations, sukkah decorations, that are 4 tefachim removed from the schach, so they dangle down into the sukkah 4 tefachim, Rav Nachman Amakshir, Rav Chizda, Rabbi Bar Ravuna Amir Psula, Rav Nachman says no problem. Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Ravuna say it is a problem. If it's 4 tefachim away, it's a problem. We also saw earlier today that Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Ravuna say that 4 tefachim is considered a significant space, and therefore sukkah underneath another sukkah, it's considered, once there's a space of 4 tefachim, then it's considered a sukkah underneath a sukkah. So we see this concept of 4 tefachim being significant, according to Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Ravuna. So they say that if decorations dangle into the sukkah 4 tefachim, it's possible. Rav Chizda Rabba Bar Ravuna iklu levereish gelusa. So Rav Chizda Rabba Bar Ravuna visited the reish gelusa, the exilarch. Agninu Rav Nachman besukkah shenoi muflagim mimena arba tefachim, and Rav Nachman gave them a sukkah to sleep in that had decorations that were more than 4 tefachim separated from the schach. Now, as Rashi points out in the Dibra Maskar of Nachman, Bezdin Oya, Rav Nachman was the head of the Bezdin, Vinogid, and he was powerful, he was a ruler. And he would decree in the house of the Reish Gelusa, and they would do what he says. I believe also he was the son-in-law of the Reish Gelusa. So Rav Nachman was a very powerful figure, very interesting. And anyway, so Rav Chizda and Rabba Bar Ravuna visited the Reish Gelusa, and Rav Nachman, who was an important figure there, said, okay, here's where you're going to stay, and he put them in a sukkah that had decorations that were 4 tefachim beneath the schach, which of course, according to Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Ravuna, is possible. But according to Rav Nachman, it's kosher. And they didn't say anything. They were happy. Rav Nachman put them in a sukkah that he knows that according to them is possible, because the decorations are more than 4 tefachim from the schach, and they didn't say anything. So Rav Nachman says to them, wait, have you changed your mind? To say like I say, that even if the decorations are 4 tefachim from the schach, it's still kosher? Why aren't you saying anything? I thought you guys argue with me. Amrulei, Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Ravuna respond to, Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Ravuna respond to Rav Nachman, and they say, we are messengers to do a mitzvah, and therefore we're patur from sukkah, and that's why we're not saying anything. We do think that this sukkah is possible because the decorations are 4 tefachim away from the schach. However, we are patur from sukkah, and therefore it doesn't matter that the sukkah is possible. because we are shluchei mitzvah. We're messengers to do a mitzvah. What mitzvah are they doing? The mitzvah of seeing your Rebbe on the Shalosh Regalim. And therefore they wanted to visit the Reish Galusa, this important figure, on the Shalosh Regalim. And therefore they were going to do a mitzvah to be Mekabel, the Reish Galusa. And therefore they were on a mitzvah, and therefore they were shluchei mitzvah, or pater from the sukkah. And therefore they say, even though yes, this is a pasul sukkah, because the decorations are more than 4 tefachim from the schach, nonetheless it's okay for us because we actually don't need to be in a sukkah at all. Alright. Rav Yehuda Shmuel says, Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, muter lishon bechila b'sukkah, says Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel that if you're in your sukkah, you're allowed to sleep in a kilu, in this tent, essentially, inside of the sukkah. That if you have a bed, and there's 4 bedposts next to, surrounding the bed, and then you put up like a sheet on top of it, and your mamish like in like a tent inside of the sukkah. Says of Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, muter lishan bechila b'sukkah. You're allowed to sleep inside this kila, inside this bit, like covered bed inside of a sukkah. Afal pi sheyesh la gag, even though it has a roof, v'usheina gavoa asar. However, it has to be less than 10 tefachim tall. If it's less than 10 tefachim tall, so it's kind of like you said earlier, that kechsher kach psula, that in order for it to be possible, it would have to be kosher first. So ki'ilu, in order for it to be a problem of sleeping inside of a tent, inside of a sukkah, the tent would have to be at least 10 tefachim tall. But one second, we have a brayso that says that if a fellow sleeps in a kila inside of a sukkah, he's not yotzei schiv of sleeping in a sukkah. So we'll answer and say, yeah, but that's talking about where the kila is 10 tefachim tall. May say we have a kasha, yoshin tachas amita b'sukkah. If you have a fellow who sleeps underneath a bed in a sukkah, so kilu, you're not sleeping underneath the sukkah, you're sleeping underneath the bed, which is underneath the sukkah. Lo yotzi dei chavaso, you don't fulfill your obligation. So Shmuel says again that that's talking about a bed that's 10 tefachim tall. Tashmau shepiris agabe kinofis psula. One second, we have a brayso that says that if you spread out a sheet on top of these bedposts, it's psula. Hasumnami de geviyei asar. So again, we'll say over there, it's talking about where this tent is essentially 10 tefachim tall. But one second, you can't say that over here, that by these bedposts, we're talking about where it's less than 10 tefachim tall, because the Tanya we learn in the brayso, naklitin shnaim, that naklite amita are when you have one bedpost at your feet and one at your head, and then you kind of put a sheet on top, so it kind of comes to a point and there's no roof. But kinofos are when you have 4 bedposts and then there's a roof on top of it if you put a sheet there. Peris agabe kinofis psula. If you spread out a sheet on top of the kinofos, on top of the 4 bedposts where there's a roof, it's psula. Agabe naklitin kshera. If you spread a sheet on top of these naklitin where it comes to a point at the top, it's kshera. Vilvad shlo yiyu naklitin gavona min hamita asar. As long as these naklitin, this pointed top, is less than 10 tefachim. Meaning, as long as this tent thing that comes to a point at the top is less than 10 tefachim from the bed, it's okay. But if it's above 10 tefachim, then it's a problem. Michlal, implying the kinofis, that when you have 4 bedposts and you have a roof, af al pisha in gavon asara, even though they're less than 10 tefachim, it's still a problem, which is a kasha on Shmuel. Because Shmuel says that in order for this tent with a roof to be a problem, it would have to be at least 10 tefachim tall. Yet we have this brayso that seems to be saying that when it's less than 10 tefachim tall, when you have it come to a point at the top, it's okay. But if it comes to a roof at the top, then it's a problem, even less than 10 tefachim. So it's a kasha on Shmuel. Shiny kinofis, the Gemara answers no. Kinofis are different than a kila, the kvi'e. Because kinofis are fixed. They're permanent. So therefore, what did Shmuel say? Shmuel said that a kila, right? Amar Rav Yehuda Shmuel, murtalishan bechila b'sukkah. A kila is like kinofis in that a kila has a roof and kinofis have a roof, but kinofis are permanent. kila is temporary. You can dismantle it. And therefore, a kila, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim, it's kosher. Kinofis, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, it's pasul. Sukkah agabe sukkah, the kviya, but one second. What about a sukkah that's on top of a sukkah? So that's talking about something that's fixed. From Shmuel, and Shmuel says, Kechshera kach psula. And Shmuel says that in order for a sukkah on top of a sukkah to make the bottom one pasul, or like if you have a sukkah underneath a sukkah, the bottom one would be pasul only if the top one is 10 tefachim. Implying that if it's less than 10 tefachim, meaning that if it's less than 10 tefachim, the bottom one is kosher. But what about that it's kavua? Meaning if Shmuel is saying that the nafkamina between the kinofis and the kila is that the kinofis is kavua, and therefore, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, it's a problem. Well, what about a sukkah that's underneath another sukkah, that we say if the top sukkah is less than 10 tefachim, then the bottom sukkah is okay, but both sukkahs are kavua, and therefore shouldn't that make the top one a problem, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, just like the kinofis? So, Amri Hasim, they say that there's a difference. To the mifsal sukkah ba'asara, that when it comes to the sukkah that's underneath another sukkah, that we're mamish going to say that the bottom one is pasul. So there, in order for the bottom one to be pasul, the top one would have to be a proper sukkah, it would have to be 10 tefachim. But hacha to the shavya oela, but over here, just to say that if it's a tent, if it's an ohel, you're sleeping in a bed inside of the sukkah, and the kasha is the bed in ohel in its own right, well then it can even be an ohel if it's less than 10 tefachim, as long as it's kavua, as long as it's the kinofis which are kavua. But in order to say that the bottom sukkah is pasul when there's a sukkah on top of it, the top sukkah would have to be a proper sukkah, it would have to be 10 tefachim tall. Amr of Tachlifa Ba'arvimi, Amr Shmuel says, Rav Tachlifa Ba'arvimi, in the name of Shmuel, Ayoshin Bechila Arum. If a fellow is sleeping naked in a kila, Motzi Rosho Chutz L'Chila V'Kor Kriya Shema, he could stick his head out of the kila and read Kriya Shema. Meisvei, we have a kasha, Ayoshin Bechila Arum Lo Yotzi Rosho Chutz L'Chila V'Kor Kriya Shema. But 1 second, we have a brayso that says, if a fellow is sleeping in a kila naked, he should not stick his head out of the kila in order to read Kriya Shema. And here what are we talking about? Kishagavoa asara. So when the brayso says do not stick your head out of the kila and read Kriya Shema, that's talking about where the kila is 10 tefachim tall. Because it's 10 tefachim tall, it's considered like a proper oil. And because it's a proper oil, your head is considered where your body is. And therefore, even if you stick your head out of the kila, it doesn't matter. It's still considered like your head is inside the kila, and it's going to be a problem. However, when Shmuel says that you're allowed to stick, right, when Rav Tachlifa Ba'arvimi says in the name of Shmuel that you're allowed to stick out your head outside of the kila and read Kriya Shema, that's talking about where the kila is less than 10 tefachim, therefore it's not a proper ohel, and your head is considered therefore just like when you stick it out of your shirt or something. It's considered like it's outside of the kila, not where the rest of your body is, and you could read Kriya Shema. This taka makes sense from the fact that the seifa of the brayso says, that the continuation of the brayso says, what is this similar to? La'omid b'vayis arum. This kila is similar to somebody who's standing in his house naked. That if a fellow is standing in his house naked, he shouldn't just stick his head out the window to read Kriya Shema, because his head will be considered where the rest of his body is, inside the house, and you'll be reading Kriya Shema naked, and we don't want that. And therefore, the same thing applies to a kila. If it's 10 tefachim tall, so then it'll be considered like a proper oil, and then don't just stick your head outside of the kila and read Kriya Shema, because your head's going to be like where the rest of your body is, inside the oil, and you're naked and you shouldn't be reading Kriya Shema. However, if the kila is less than 10 tefachim, so then it's not considered an oil, and it's just considered like your clothing, let's say, where you could obviously stick your head outside of your clothing and read Kriya Shema. So also you'd be able to stick your head outside of the kila and read Kriya Shema in that case. But if we're talking about a proper house, even if it's less than 10 tefachim, given to kviya, since it is set, it's kavua, it's permanent, it will be considered a tent de logar mikinofos, because it's no different than these like bedposts which are considered kavua, and and therefore a house that's less than 10 tefachim, you shouldn't be sticking your head outside if you're naked and read Kriya Shema. Alright, sounds very gewaldig. That was Daf Yud of Masechta Sukkah. Let's do a shtickle review. So the daf began with all sorts of different sukkahs underneath sukkahs. Sometimes they're both kosher, sometimes they're both pasul, sometimes one of them's kosher, one of them's pasul, sometimes it's the top one, sometimes it's the bottom one. Fine. Then we discuss what's the minimum space between the two sukkahs for it to be considered a sukkah underneath a sukkah. Rav Huna says it's a tefach, based on the significance by Tumah. Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna say that it's talking about 4 tefachim, and Shmuel says it's talking about 10 tefachim. We discussed putting a sheet underneath the schach. Well, on top of the schach, underneath the schach. Don't put a sheet on top of the schach to protect you from the sun, and don't put it underneath the schach in order to receive, to catch any shmutz that might fall from the schach, because that would be considered like you're using pasul schach. However, says Rav Chizda, you would be allowed to use a tapestry of sorts for decoration. That would be acceptable. We then had a machlokas between Rav Nachman on the one hand and Rav Chizda / Rabbi Bar Rav Huna on the other, about what if the decorations of the sukkah are 4 tefachim separated from the 4 tefachim lower than the schach. Rav Nachman says it's kosher. Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna say it is possible. There was an interesting story with Rav Nachman when Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna went to visit the Reish Galusa, and Rav Nachman put them into a sukkah that the decorations were more than 4 tefachim from the schach, and Rav Chizda and Rabbi Bar Rav Huna didn't say anything. And the reason why they didn't say anything is because they were shluchei mitzvah. They were on the way to do a mitzvah to greet the Reish Galusa on the Shalosh Regalim, and therefore they were patur from sukkah, and that's why it didn't matter that the decorations were more than 4 tefachim from the schach. Okay, we also had said that the decorations do not do anything to affect the height of a sukkah, and therefore if you have a sukkah that is taller than 20 amas, you cannot lower it by hanging decorations. Also, if you have a sukkah that is 10 tefachim tall, so then the decorations would not make it lower than 10 tefachim, and it would still be a kosher sukkah. However, Rav Ashi points out that from the sides, it would be a problem, right? So if you need a sukkah to be Rosh Rubav Shulchanu, you have to be able to fit in Rosh Rubav Shulchanu. If you have decorations on the side of the sukkah, now you can no longer fit Rosh Rubav Shulchanu. Rav Ashi points out that it would be a problem. Then we saw the opinion of Shmuel, who says that if you sleep essentially in a tent inside of the sukkah, right, if on top of your bed you put up, you hang over like a sheet on top of the bedposts, so it says Shmuel, as long as it's less than 10 tefachim tall, it's fine. If it's more than 10 tefachim tall, it is a problem. Cheved, that was Daf Yud. I hope you enjoyed. Cheers.